What's up everyone? Welcome to the first installment of Workout Tip Wednesday, where we're going to be discussing hot lifting topics, debunking some myths, breaking down lifts, and giving you some tips to make your lifts the most efficient possible. So today we're going to be talking about when rounding of the lower back is a problem and how to fix it. So the first thing to discuss is that there's two different kinds of rounding of the back when it comes to the deadlift. The first one is rounding that's coming from the upper back. The second one's rounding from the lower back. So as far as upper back rounding, that is not necessarily a problem. First of all, because your upper back is naturally kyphotic, so that means that it has a naturally convex shape, which is outwards like that. So when you're lifting naturally, the muscles that support your rhomboids and your upper back aren't that strong. So sometimes they're going to be overpowered by the weight that you're lifting. So that's why you see some lifters kind of their shoulders roll forward and their upper backs get slightly more rounded. But that's not necessarily a problem because you're not compromising any of the structures of your lower back or your upper back, or your discs or ligaments or anything like that. The second thing we see with the upper back rounding is rounding that's confused for muscle hypertrophy. So a lot of especially bigger guys, bigger lifters have a lot of meat in the upper back and it looks as if they're rounding, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes that's just the shape and fullness of their muscles. So don't confuse rounding for muscle hypertrophy. It's not necessarily a problem. It's not necessarily something that you need to address. Now, we do want to focus on rounding that comes from the lower back, because we do know that excessive rounding of the lower back can potentially lead to disc herniations, because the mechanism of injury for a disc is forward flexion, side bending rotation, especially under load. So when is rounding from the lower back a problem? When should we actually take steps and direct our efforts towards addressing it? Because it certainly isn't a big deal in a lot of cases, and that's what we're going to discuss. The first instance in which rounding of your lower back becomes a problem is rounding that becomes increasingly worse as the lift progresses. So someone who starts their deadlift and they have a neutral spine, and then as the weight gets off the floor, their rounding gets worse and worse towards the top of the deadlift, that's something that you want to address. Versus someone that starts their lift in a slightly rounded position and continues the lift in that locked and tight and safe position. So look at your videos and try to see whether you can maintain that slightly rounded position from start to finish of the lift, or are you letting your form deteriorate as the lift goes from A to B. The second instance that you want to be aware of fixing your rounding of your lower back is excessive lower back rounding. So there is a difference. We already discussed the shape of the upper back and said that it's kyphotic, so it's convex, whereas in the lower back, your back is naturally lordotic or concave. And so when you're lifting, it's almost impossible to keep that natural lordotic curve. So you'll see a lot of people going from lordosis to neutral and even a little bit further to slight rounding. So as long as you're not taking your vertebra, your spine, to an end range, that is not a dangerous or vulnerable position for your spine. And finally, unpreparedness for movement. I've said it over and over again, if you follow me on my social media and Instagram, that there's no such thing as bad movement, just unpreparedness for movement. And so it is possible for people to actually train themselves to be strong and stable, the keyword stable, in a slightly rounded position. Now, I'm not saying go full-blown cat. I'm saying a slight rounding of your lower back. You can actually train yourself to be strong in that position. So there's a misconception that our backs become magically unstable as soon as your back goes from neutral to slightly rounded, and that's just not true. There are a lot of things in your lower back that are protective and that provide stability to your spine, like ligaments and like muscles, both from the posterior side or the back of your back and your core, that are actually contributing to stability of the spine. All right, now that we know when rounding of the lower back is an issue, we can get into how to fix it. So the first thing to take into consideration is, especially if you're a beginner / intermediate beginner lifter, you gotta learn the rules before you break the rules. So you better be learning how to deadlift with a neutral spine And then if your body proportions and your style of lifting is kind of moving you towards a slightly more rounded position, then you can train yourself and make sure that you're taking the appropriate steps to make that position safe. But definitely learn how to deadlift with a perfectly straight back, and don't allow yourself to move shitty. Now we can get a little bit deeper into what kind of exercises can help you fix your rounding of the lower back. Now, the first misconception is that when you round your lower back, you need to get your lower back stronger, and it's actually the opposite. One of the main reasons why you're rounding your lower back is because you're relying on the muscles of your lower back to extend your hips or to finalize the lift, because it's actually your strongest muscle. And that's really that really goes against what your common sense would be, because most people would think that if you're rounding your lower back and it's flexing, that you need to strengthen it more so that it straightens. But that's not necessarily the case. What you need to be focusing on is strengthening your glutes and your hamstrings, because those two muscles are in charge of hip extension, especially in the final portion of your deadlift. So instead of focusing your attention on strengthening your lower back, shift that and try to strengthen your glutes and your hamstrings, so that you can rely on those structures at the end of the lift and you don't put that much stress and strain on your lower back muscles. The first exercise that I'm going to suggest is the dumbbell deadlift, and this is basically just a top-down deadlift. You will initiate the lift with the barbell on a rack, take it off the rack, and start the lift from the top, taking a deep breath, staying tight from the top, lowering the bar below your knees, and coming back up. And pretty much that's gonna allow you to be more mindful of the position of your lower back and get in a tighter setup from the top rather than getting off position from the floor. The second exercise that I'm gonna recommend is hip thrusts. Hip thrust, really focus on your glute max development. That's a muscle that you wanna focus on whenever you find yourself relying on your lower back muscles. So basically all you want to do is set up with your back on a pad or on a bench, put the barbell on the crease of your hip, and just imagine that there's a straight line coming from the top of your head to the bottom of your hips. And you want to keep that line straight the whole time. So you don't want to let your back or your neck curve, you just want to stay straight the whole entire time. And finally, the last exercise that I'm going to teach you today is a good morning. When I'm teaching this to a beginner, I like to have them do a partial rep good morning, where I would set the safety racks a little bit higher than perfectly parallel to the ground, so that they can learn the movement and do it with good form, rather than just going through the motions and allowing their spines to move. So this is a great exercise because the bar is placed on your back, and you really have to fight to keep your back straight and your glutes engaged to do a perfect rep. And that concludes this episode of Workout Tips Wednesday. So if you guys have any suggestions of topics that I should cover, make sure that you drop them down below. Also, stay tuned for my next video coming up Friday, and see you guys next time.